Hi, I'm Ralph Dinsley, known as Dins. I'm the Executive Director and Founder of Northern Spaces Security, and I listen to the Cold Star Project.
This show is for entertainment purposes only and is not intended to be what is termed professional advice. The Cold Star Project is proudly presented by the Operational Excellence Society. Cold Star Tech is a supporter of the OPEX Society, and Jason Kanigan is a member of its board of advisors. Talk with us at Cold Star Tech to find out more about the OPEX Society and what we can achieve together in your organization, or just visit opexsociety.org. Thanks for joining us for today's show. This time on the Cold Star Project, I am very pleased to have David Walker back. He is a past Comptroller General of the United States, and I want you to remember that he served a term that was longer than 2 terms of being the U.S. President. So he has a lot of experience with the government office and strategy, budgeting, getting those guys in line, changing the culture, right? And we talked about this a little bit in his past appearance, where we really dug into the Defense Business Board and also his experience as Comptroller General. He is today the Crow Chair at US Naval Academy. He's a professor. And I wanted him back on because he wrote a book. And we're going to talk about that book. It's called America in 2040, Still a Superpower, ? Because we're not so sure, right, with the path and the public spending, the public debt that America's gone down. I'm not so sure it's going to remain that way, and so it's time to take steps. And of course, I got a copy of David's book, read it, took notes, and we're about to have a great discussion about it and what David thinks is necessary, and I happen to agree, to get the country back on track. So David, welcome. All right, Dave, so we're here to talk about your book, America in 2040, Still a Superpower, ? And it is a guide, a pathway to success. And I had a lot of fun reading this book and pulling out some nuggets and some surprising details. Ross Perot snuck in there somehow. I want to chat about him for a second as we get in there. And so, you know, you were Comptroller General for 9 years, as we were talking about before hitting record. That's longer than 2-term presidents. And so you get a view from a height from doing that, and some knowledge and some perspective that other people are unlikely to get, right? And so I found that especially the first half of this book kind of lays out the what, and then the second half gets into a lot of charts and graphs, and for the visual learners in that, which you and I know are really important to convey the how, right? So I want to begin with this. There is a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by a guy named Albert Hirschman from back in the 70s. He investigated organizations in decline and found that people would pick one of 3 options. They'd either leave, or they would speak up, or they would shut their mouths and go along with the party line kind of thing. And I feel that your book here, Voice, has been the option, right? You've chosen to speak out and say, no, I want to do something different here. What made you believe that writing a book was the best way to influence others?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that this is, just one of many steps that I've taken, and this is just the latest book. Talking about those 3 options, I chose the speak up option and speak out option. I was Comptroller General of the United States for almost 10 years, and during that period of time, I became convinced that Washington policymakers had lost control of the nation's finances and had put us on an irresponsible and unsustainable course. And every year, the GAO would issue a variety of reports, the long-range fiscal outlook, the audit report on the United States. But issuing reports just doesn't get the job done, all right? And so I decided that I needed to be more proactive. And that's when I ended up working with think tanks on the right and the left. We did the fiscal wake-up tour. 60 Minutes interviewed me. There was a critically acclaimed documentary, IOUSA, was done. And it was all, professional, objective, fact-based, nonpartisan, non-ideological approach. And the concern over this issue, our fiscally irresponsible, unsustainable path, reached an all-time high in 2012. But since then, we're actually in much worse position. And yet people are still issuing reports, but nothing is being done. I issued a book in 2010 called Come Back America, Turning the Country Around and Restoring Fiscal Responsibility. It was a national bestseller, and it helped contribute to increasing awareness. And then since then, I've seen things get worse, and I decided that given my background, given my new position over the last 2 years as being a professor at the Naval Academy, which gave me a lot more national security experience and expertise, that it was time to issue a new book. And that's why I wrote American 2040, Still a Superpower, ? And it's geared more towards policymakers, but it is written in a way that is understandable for anybody with a high school education. And because this is the future of our country, it's the future of our families, and I think everybody has a stake in the issue.
Right. Yeah, it is an approachable book. There are lots of charts and graphs. I was joking before we started that this is Stephen Hawking quote that every equation you add cuts your readership in half. And Dave was quick to correct me. There is only one equation in the book, and it's in the appendix. So you got to go digging for that one.
And I apologize for it.
Right. So there's lots of charts and graphs in the second half. Now we've got a couple of supporting authors on here. You've got Admiral Bill Owens, who wrote the foreword, and he was a vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also John Newble, who's I looked up a little bit and found out he was with the US Navy, and that's about all I learned. So I'm curious, what kinds of contributions they made to the book.
Sure. Well, Bill Owens is a friend. John Newble's a friend, and Bill was vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the second highest ranking position in the U.S. military. During the Clinton administration, when there was a drawdown of our military, the size of our military, if you will, in an attempt to try to restructure our defense positioning. John Newble is also a Naval Academy graduate with Bill. John is a Rhodes Scholar. John also was Chief Financial Officer of Housing and Urban Development. He was also had positions in the Defense Department. And the three of us have been engaged in this issue in different ways for a number of years. We're all very concerned about the threat to our economic and national security posed by our current position and path. And we're all trying to work in various ways to, wake up policymakers and try to encourage them to be able to adopt some sensible solutions before it's too late.
Mm-hmm. All right. One thing that hopped out of the foreword by Admiral Owens to me was that thinking 20 years ahead, i.e. what you're doing here, is rare, he says, in our government. And that disturbed me. I was like, why is that the case?
Well, frankly, teenagers tend to look to the weekend. Politicians tend to look to the next election. And by definition, if you're in the House, that's no more than 2 years away. If you're in the Senate, that's no more than 6 years away. In addition to that, while China has a long-range strategic plan that is updated periodically, the United States does not. And so one of the biggest arguments that I make is, look, if you don't have a plan, all you have is prayer. Don't get me wrong, I'm for prayer, but I'm for prayer and a plan. And when I was at the GAO and head of the Comptroller General of the United States, we did our first ever strategic plan in 2000, and it was the broadest, the longest range, the most integrated plan the U.S. government had, and it's still that way. So it's time for the federal government to recognize that you just can't require individual departments and agencies to do planning. You need to have a comprehensive, forward-looking, threat, risk, opportunity-based, outcome-oriented, resource-constrained plan. And we still don't, and we need one.
Right. Yeah, you'll have pieces of the government. DOD will put out some sort of threat assessment or something. The space industry had a resources kind of guide that came out a year or two ago. Right. But it's not coordinated, right? It's guys talking from here and over there, and they're not getting together.
The other thing, sometimes they are inconsistent. Sometimes they're overlapping. Sometimes they have gaps. Sometimes they work against each other. You'd be amazed. I mean, we're trying to control, for example, the government's trying to control healthcare costs, right? We spend way more per person than any other nation on earth, and yet we get below average outcomes. What's the single largest tax preference in the Internal Revenue Code? Healthcare. So we're trying to provide incentives, and it also it reduces the transparency of the cost of healthcare. So we're trying to control the cost. On the other hand, our federal policies are doing things that do exactly the opposite. They're increasing the cost and reducing transparency.
Okay. Well, let's begin with this here, Dave. Let's hear your definition of superpower, because that is the word in the title, still a superpower, question mark, right? We better pick that target out, right, and define it. So you've got 4 dimensions of what that means. So
Yeah, in my view, a modern day superpower is a country that has global economic, diplomatic, and military power and cultural influence. And I believe that since the end of World War II, the United States is the only country that has met that definition. The Soviet Union did not meet the economic criteria, nor did it meet the cultural influence criteria. But now we're facing a re-emerging China, who either has met the criteria or will meet it in the near future. And unlike the United States, they have a plan and they're executing on the plan. And unlike the United States, they are working more on a multilateral basis, if you will, and they are investing more in national security rather than less.
Okay. Yeah, nobody was importing Soviet jeans or music to America. And at the height, folks, a lot of people don't know this, the Soviet economy was only 1/3 the size of the United States. So, you move next into what we can learn from, it's a very quick covering of past major powers about the problem of protecting and maintaining their economic growth and military strength decade after decade after decade, right? And the ones that jumped out to me, because I know quite a bit about them already, you mentioned the Turks, Rome really stood out to me. And we know their problems, right? They were expansionist and constantly going to war with their neighbors and the outside edge to try and turn that into slaves and money and profit and that. But the thing that you brought up that really struck me was the declining civility in the politics, right? And we saw this, right? In the early days of the Roman Republic, the senators could go to work. And they went to work unarmed, right? But after a while, they had to go to work armed. And then they went to work with private armies. And then they would get murdered in the streets and sometimes in the Senate, right? And so it got really ugly. So let's cover that for a minute. Why did civility matter so much when you were writing this?
Well, I talked about you need to learn from the past in order to better prepare for the future. Because if you don't learn from the past, you might be destined to repeat some of the same mistakes that others have made. And I talked about a number of past powers, including Rome. Rome, I think, is a lot of parallels between Rome and us. Okay, they were a republic for much longer than we've been a republic, but then the republic fell and they became an empire. All right, and it fell for a number of reasons: declining political civility, moral decay, fiscal irresponsibility, overextended military, and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar?
Yep.
They're very consistent. Okay, and so I think that the other thing I try to point out is the leading indicator on the way up and the leading indicator on the way down of a great power is economic power. Because economic power brings diplomatic influence, okay, brings cultural influence, and it enables military strength. And so, yes, we're still a strong country from the standpoint of economics. We're the largest economy based on nominal GDP. We're second on purchasing power parity. We've got a lot higher GDP per capita than China does. But the bottom line is that our underlying economic growth has declined significantly. And we face a number of challenges, including mounting debt to GDP levels, which is going to complicate it even further if we don't start making some tough choices.
Right.
So,
agreed.
Look, right now we have a republic that is not representative of nor responsive to the general public. We have career politicians, which the founding fathers never intended. They intended to have people that came out of the real world for a temporary period of time to do public service and then went back to the real world. We have too many Republicans that are too far to the right. We have too many Democrats that are too far to the left. We have little overlap between Republican and Democratic elected officials, so they don't want to compromise. The margins in the House and the Senate are so close that every election could result in a change of control, which further complicates the situation. And 43% of Americans, including myself, are unaffiliated. And yet we're largely unrepresented because when they create boards and commissions and they make appointments, they're making them along partisan lines. I mean, they might require bipartisan action. They don't require transpartisan action. So it's a real challenge that we have to come to grips with to solve a number of longstanding challenges that are getting worse with the passage of time.
Right. And I hear you on the transpartisanship thing. That's so important. I ran for public office in my hometown, and it was, you know, an unaffiliated thing there. And yeah, it's so easy to get people trying to pull you in one direction or another. And
they want you to wear a color uniform. They want you to wear a color uniform. You're either blue or you're red. You're either with us or you're against us. Right. They want to try to keep it really simplistic. The world's not that simple, okay? I mean, a lot of our real challenges are really complicated. You know, you got to do tough things. And compromise is not a bad word. It's a good word. Right. Remember what Reagan said. If you can get 70% of what you want, take it and live to fight another day.
Right. And this, folks, this is not a crackpot book, okay? This is a moderate, sensible book. I want to make that point. I also want to go back to something we just covered about economic decline, right? And the problem with that. When you find wars in history, it's often with a declining great power and a rising economic power. We see this a lot. And I, for one, want to avoid war. I don't particularly care for you or me or anybody else, even our opponents, to get blown up. I don't want to see it, right? And so we've got to watch out for these situations and make sure that we're maintaining our strength here. So Dave, specifically looking at the US now, the book is American 2040, looking out that 20 years. If we don't change our course, what kind of outcomes can we expect by 2040 that are putting us really in the stewing pot, right? A real mess here.
Well, our influence internationally will decline. The role that the dollar plays in the international economy will decline. In addition to that, and probably more importantly than that to most Americans, is our gaps within the United States will increase. We have three large gaps today in the United States. We have an income gap, we have a wealth gap, and we have an education gap. And the education gap is by far the most important because it is the driver of income and wealth. Those gaps have grown. COVID-19 has exacerbated all three of those gaps. If we don't put our finances in order, not only are we going to put at risk our international standing and our standing as a superpower, we'll still be a big power, but we may not be a superpower. But just as importantly, if not more so, we're going to have serious domestic tranquility problems because of growing gaps and inequities.
Right. If people aren't happy, they riot occasionally. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. You've got.
But we can avoid all of that, and that's what's important. You know, the book is a wake-up call, a call to action, and a way forward. So we can solve this problem. But we need to deal with the biggest deficit in the United States in the public arena, and that's our leadership deficit. We have too many people living for today. We don't have enough people that are trying to prepare a better tomorrow.
Okay. And we've got a serious problem here with the deficit and the debt. And I think I don't really know if the average person on the street really knows about this or thinks about it, and I wish they would. That's just a key thing. Like, well, it doesn't affect me. Well, it does, because our dollar value declines, which means your dollar buys less, right?
And if inflation, if inflation continues to go up, that's the cruelest tax of all.
Right.
And who ends up getting hurt the most with inflation? The least well off.
Yeah. You got to go buy bread. You got to go. We know the price of lumber has gone through the roof. I was looking at a wooden pallet business here in the South because there's no pallets, and farmers need pallets, right? And they're priced at 3 times the price if you could get the wood and put them together.
And it's not just fiscal policy, which is tax and spending. Our monetary policy is irresponsible and unsustainable. Interest rates are at all-time lows. We don't have market-based interest rates. The interest rates right now are being artificially manipulated to stay low in order to minimize interest expense to the federal government, in order to try to promote economic growth. And as a result of that, people, they're not getting paid anything for their savings. Savers are getting penalized tremendously. Okay, One of the reasons that you've had a significant increase in real estate values is because mortgage rates are so low, right? And people are trying to look for yield. How are they going to make some money? How are they going to stay ahead of inflation? When your bank account pays 0.05%, and inflation is 2%, 3%, 4%, you're losing ground, all right? And so that's one of the reasons the stock market has gone up, is because people have thrown a lot of money because they can't make money on, through savings. They can't make money through bonds because, of what's happening to the bonds. And so they're trying to take more risk, and they're trying to go into the stock market. And so far it's paid off, but that's not forever.
Right. Nope. I wrote a paper about investment capital, venture capital in the space industry. And I referred to a major paper on advancing credit and investment. As the interest rates go down and people look for more and more crazy ways to invest their money to make a profit, things start to get really lopsided, and they put their money into public works projects that don't make sense, and things that go upside down. And we've seen this through history. So here's a title of a chapter here that I'm going to turn into a question here. In your opinion, what is today's greatest economic and national security threat to America?
Yeah, I argue in the book, it's our own fiscal irresponsibility. Okay. That has been echoed by a number of individuals, including former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, who's also a friend of mine, who said that he also believes it's our greatest national security threat. Bill Owens, who wrote the foreword for the book, who's former vice chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the same thing. You've had the head of the Fed, you've had the head of OMB, the head of CBO, the head of GAO. I can go on and on and on, who have said that we're on an improved and unsustainable path. All right. And it's gotten much worse. The problem is nothing's being done about it.
Okay. And you're predicting a huge amount of public debt by 2050. The chart is one of those awful.
It's not me, it's the Congressional Budget Office.
Right.
And the shocking thing is the book was released at the end of September 2020. And we had another major piece of COVID legislation happen in January. And now we've got another major piece of legislation, and then we've got other ones beyond that. So it's actually worse than shown in the book, although it's bad enough in the book.
Yeah. So it's just give, and then nothing's coming back in to pay into the system.
Well, but now you have people that are espousing this new modern monetary theory, okay, also known as money grows on trees, if you will, theory, which basically says that we don't need to worry about deficits and debt as long as we can borrow in our own reserve currency until we have an inflation problem. Well, guess what? That kind of policy is contrary to history, contrary to basic economics, based on a flawed comparison to Japan. It will cause the problem that it seeks, that it says what enables it, and it provides an excuse for already irresponsible politicians to be even more irresponsible, and so it's downright dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to upset some economists here. Say I took 3 years of economics in college. I got to intermediate macroeconomic theory and made a model of the Canadian economy. And what I found out was that basically economics is a modern day priesthood, and it's got its own ideas, it's got its own factions, it's got its own theories, and there's no one right way here. There's just guesses. There may be educated guesses and guesses with evidence backing a theory, but we don't actually know. And so any economist who pushes forward a theory, it's just a theory, folks. Something fun happened in the book at this point. Ross Perot walked into it, and I've been a fan of Ross Perot for a very long time, decades. He was very family oriented. He treated his business like a family. One of the great stories that I read was folks had to check in, especially on weekends and that, where they were. And if they were missing, the helicopters would be in the air, looking for him, right? And so you met him? Right?
I'm pleased and proud to say he was a friend of mine. Yeah. Ross Perot, when I did the 60-minute segment in 2007, the first person to call me was Ross Perot. who congratulated me for speaking out. Ross also was the person who wrote a personal check to underwrite the 10 million a minute tour in 2012. I'm pleased and proud to say that I also did the last in-person interview that he gave. He and I did it together from his office in 2012 in Plano, Texas. He was a great American, and he is the primary reason why we made progress during the Clinton administration, because he made this a priority. He went to the public. I've got one of his famous charts that he's autographed, one of the few that's outside a museum, if you will. And as a result of that, Clinton had to make it a priority for his presidency. Newt Gingrich made it a priority as part of the contract with America. And we made progress. We made real progress. But unfortunately, Ross passed a couple of years ago, and he is missed.
Mm-hmm. He is. I've enjoyed everything I've read about the man. I think he would have been tough to work for. I think he would have very high expectations of you, me, anybody as an individual. But I think he would back you up, with everything he had, 100%. So that was just a really neat moment there. So last time we talked, and folks, I'll try and include the link to that interview in the description below. If I forget doing that, someone please tell me. You educated me about the concept of the American military having the tooth and the tail, right, in our last talk. Is there anything that needs to change in military investment, in development, procurement, deployment, to ensure that America remains a superpower over the next couple decades?
Yes, and time does not allow to cover everything. So let's just cover a few, okay? The first thing that we have to do is that we need to make sure that we're focused on credible current and future threats, all right? It's very unlikely that we're gonna fight a major land engagement in Asia, all right? It's very unlikely that we're gonna fight a major land engagement in Europe, okay? There are new domains of threats. Those domains are cyber, which is probably number one, okay? Bio and space, those are all new domains. We now have total transparency of the battlefield, all right? And therefore we have to recognize that we need to move more towards artificial intelligence and unmanned vehicles, both in the air, on the sea, and under the sea. We need to rethink about what our mix ought to be between the different services, active versus reserve. We need to relook at our base structure, both domestically and around the world. We need to restructure our compensation system, because we have three components of compensation. We have cash compensation, current benefits, and deferred benefits. The most expensive is deferred benefits. The second most expensive is current benefits. The least expensive is cash compensation. We've got the best military on the earth, but it's incredibly expensive, all right, if you will. We need to dramatically reduce the amount of overhead that we have as part of the Department of Defense. It's grown dramatically. We need to cut the tail, which is the overhead, and so to free up more money for the tooth, which is a warfighting capability. We need to look at these different operations in the Defense Department, such as Defense Logistics Agency, Defense Health Agency, or whatever. They are massive businesses. There are Fortune 100 company equivalents, and we need to treat them as that with regard to the governance structure and how we run them. There's just a number of things that we need to do. So the bottom line is we need to look beyond how much money are we spending, or how are we spending that money, and what are we getting for it, okay? Because there's a lot of waste in defense. On the other hand, there are areas that we ought to be spending more. And right now we've got a situation where China is going to spend 6% plus more a year. We're spending 1.6% more for defense, 16% more proposed for non-defense. Something's wrong with that.
Okay. Yeah. So folks, up to this point, a lot of what the U.S. military is about is air blitzkrieg. We're the best at that in the world. It is very expensive. But you're saying, let's take a look at what kind of fights we should be fighting and move it to another domain, and how do we deploy our resources?
I think warfare in the future, and let's hope we can avoid it, because one of the primary reasons that you want a strong military is so you can avoid war. Right? That's one of the primary reasons you want it. And so, but I think we have to recognize that if it occurs in the future, it's going to be very different than the past. And the real threats are more in the Pacific rather than Europe when NATO was founded. And as I said, cyber is we're seeing that manifest in different ways, which are not necessarily nation states, but they could be harbored by nation states. And there's got to be accountability when they are, just as when Al-Qaeda was being harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan, we took action. The difference is we should have gotten out of Afghanistan 10 to 15 years ago rather than just now.
Right. Yep. Agreed. And would have saved lives and
treasure
funding and all kinds of things. Okay, well, let's get into our last couple of questions, which are more meaty. I think we might get into some numbers and things like that, or mechanisms and that. And again, folks, Dave here, former US Comptroller General. That's it's a big financial budgetary type position, reporting position. The guy knows his stuff, right? He's talking from the inside of the system here. So when I ask what budget controls and standards, are there any changes necessary to these to achieve the levels of results you want to see? What should we be working on first?
Well, a number of things. Okay, first, we have something called the debt ceiling limit, which has been suspended. So basically we're writing blank checks right now, okay? But that's going to expire at the end of July, this month. And so they have to end up coming to pass legislation to do something with that. We need to recognize reality. It's been a total failure. The debt ceiling limit has just become a political football. It's done nothing to be able to constrain the explosive growth of our debt. And therefore, we need to get rid of the debt ceiling limit. Ultimately, we won't do it this month. Ultimately, we need to get rid of it. We need to substitute what really matters, a debt to GDP target with automatic targets, triggers, and enforcement mechanisms. We need to supplement that with a constitutional amendment that sets a credit card limit for the United States absent a formal declaration of war or absent certain events and a supermajority vote of the Congress with the signature of the president. So we need to have much more effective constraints. We ought to go to biennial budget. We should have a separate budget for investments versus consumption, like most states. Okay, we need to recognize that you just can't pay for new spending proposals or new tax proposals, because that assumes that you're okay and all you need to do is maintain the status quo. We already can't afford what we've already promised. We've got tens of trillions of dollars of unfunded promises. So the idea that you're just going to pay for new stuff is insane. That's why we need to focus on debt to GDP and have a plan that deals both with spending, social insurance reform, and revenue enhancement that can get us to a reasonable and sustainable level of debt to GDP, given known different demographic trends, rising healthcare costs, changing security threats, domestic gaps, et cetera. So those are just a few of the things that we need to do.
Okay, and yeah, folks wanting more detail can get the book. I highly recommend you do it. And it's only a couple under, 250 pages, something like that. It's easily readable. I got through it in a couple days, and it wasn't.
And you didn't go to sleep.
It wasn't a slog. No, it was very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So how much pain do you think will be involved in the course correction here? Do you think it's going to be a big deal, or will people be able to make the adjustments?
Well, first you have to recognize, just like when you're trying to get in shape, there's some short-term pain in order to get long-term gain. All right. But you also have to do is you have to recognize, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is that we don't do what we should do, and that ultimately we're going to have a much bigger crisis. Only God knows when that's going to be. But believe me, things will have to be, it'll affect many, many more people in a much more adverse way And the type of changes that we would have to make at that point will be much more draconian. So the argument that I make is we need to recognize reality. We're on an imprudent and unsustainable course. It's getting worse with the passage of time. It's prudent to act sooner rather than later, so we don't have to make as many changes. We have more transition time. We can phase things in over time, all right? That will make it much more manageable for the politicians. It will make it much more equitable with regard to the American people. And it'll also help, reduce the burdens that we're placing on our children and grandchildren, which, frankly, is just not fair. I mean, we're doing things to them rather than for them. And that's not the American way. I mean.
Yeah. And from my study of history and economics, the folks at the von Mises Institute would be very happy to hear me say, you got to rip the Band-Aid off and do the tough things, make the tough choices, because government intervention to try and sustain things or support things seems to just make the problem last longer instead of just making the choice. And
let me give you another example of something we need to do, which I'm about ready to write an op-ed on, which I didn't address directly in the book, but I alluded to it. And that is, the Federal Reserve is also in an unsustainable position. I think it's become politicized. I think it's the degree of independence that it's demonstrating now is not very independent, quite frankly. It's enabling irresponsible behavior by buying trillions of dollars of US debt, by keeping interest rates artificially low. It's about out of tools in its toolbox to deal with the next crisis, if you will. And so I think one of the things that has to happen is that we need to eliminate the requirement that the Fed needs to be concerned with unemployment. It should be focused on two things like a laser. How do we promote long-term economic growth? How do we grow the pie? All right. And secondly, how do we maintain long-term price stability? All right. Those are the only two things that ought to be focused on. When I talk about unemployment, there are things that deal with unemployment that they can't do anything about. Education policy, immigration policy, unemployment benefit policy. Those are things they don't have anything to say over. That's the Congress's and the president's job. They should be responsible. But because of them having to be concerned with employment as part of their mandate, they've actually done some things that have actually made things worse, I believe, as far as over time, not in the short term, but over time. It increased our risk over time.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't find that surprising at all. Boy, I think, again, you point out in the book, you're not anti-immigration. We actually need immigration.
Oh, not at all. We need immigration.
And I'm an immigrant. I'm Canadian. I came here illegally and went through the process, and here I am. So
my family came to this country in the 1680s legally. Okay. But we're in a very different world today, right? Mm-hmm. I'm pro-immigration. We're the most diverse country on earth. We're the most opportunity on earth. But we need to change our immigration policies. We need to recognize reality. We need to focus more on skills and knowledge. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between legal immigration and illegal immigration. There's a difference between a pathway to citizenship and a pathway to legal status. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between a permanent right to be here and a temporary right to be here because of seasonal needs such as agriculture or whatever else. It isn't that complicated, all right? It really isn't that complicated. And we need to address that. And that, because of our political polarization, that's another example of where we haven't made progress. Another example is infrastructure. Another example is the fiscal situation. I mean, we ought to be able to make progress here. And this is also another issue that's talked about in the book.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, folks, I feel I need to remind us at this time, if we were in the presidency of John Kennedy, the average age of an American would be under 25. And all those people are grown up now. And we're, in the 70s now, right, is the average. So things have changed a lot. Birth rates are declining. We have to do something. So let's finish up with this, Dave. And it's a big question. Share your views on tax policy with us and how you envision these will alter that long-term outcome of the U.S. economy and keeping us as the top superpower.
In order to get debt to GDP down to a reasonable, sustainable level, you're going to have to do three things. You're going to have to reform social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure, all right? You're gonna have to reprioritize and reduce projected discretionary spending, okay? And you're going to have to reform the tax system and raise more revenues, all right? You can't grow your way out of this problem. You want pro-growth policies, but you can't grow your way out of the problem. The math doesn't come close to working. The problem is more a spending problem than a revenue problem, but we've got to have more revenues, and you're not going to get it through, tax cuts that make the economy grow and pay for themselves. That doesn't work, all right? It doesn't work, all right? When we laid out in the book, some of the things we talked about was, yes, we need corporate tax reform. We've got to be competitive. Corporations do not have a duty of loyalty to countries. They have duties of loyalty to their shareholders. They can and will move, all right? We've made corporate tax reform. We've made some progress in corporate tax reform to become more competitive. Frankly, we might have taken rates lower than we needed to take rates. We still have a problem in that we've got some corporations that aren't paying much, or if anything, and we need to recognize that fact. On the individual side, our tax system's way too complicated, way too complicated. We need to streamline, simplify it. Over half of Americans ought to be able to fill out their tax return on one page without the help of outside assistance, okay? That means eliminating a lot of deductions, exemptions, exclusions, reducing the number of tax rates. We need to also look at, if we can get the top tax rate down to a reasonable level, like Reagan did at 28%, okay, by eliminating a lot of deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions, we can tax capital gains and dividends the same as ordinary income. By the way, that's how rich people make their money. They don't make their money on wages. And you don't have to pay social insurance taxes on investment income, all right? So there's a number of things that we can do that would enhance revenues, enhance our competitive posture, and improve equity while promoting simplicity and therefore compliance. Because the fact that the system is so complicated means that it's that much more easy for people to avoid paying taxes and to catch the people who are doing that illegally.
Okay, and other states have done this.
Yes, absolutely. This
names,
is not. Other states have done this, and with success. All right. Yeah. But again, you've got a lot of powerful interest groups. I'll come back to something we said at the beginning. The single largest tax preference in the Internal Revenue Code is the fact that individuals do not pay income tax or payroll taxes on employer-provided and paid health care. Hundreds of billions a year. That fuels additional healthcare costs. We need to be doing the opposite. Last time I checked, healthcare insurance was compensation. Why shouldn't it be paid? Why shouldn't it be taxed like compensation? People don't realize that their wages are being constrained because employers are paying a lot more money for healthcare than they realize, and they don't even see how much that is.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things that people supported was, maybe you maintain tax preference for a modest amount of healthcare, but some of the most lucrative plans, quite frankly, for healthcare are by public servants.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like, where do you target the improvement expertise to be applied? Because you can go after tax cuts and that. They did it around 2000 with the estate tax, rebranded it the death tax, and got total approval, right, from across the aisle, and that.
Let's take the vernacular.
Yeah.
The death tax, right?
Yeah.
How about the birth burden? How about the fact that every new baby that's born in this country is born with a huge unfunded obligation that is only getting worse with the passage of time? Okay. One of the things that's being talked about now, and there are pros and cons to it, okay, is a wealth tax. All right. Because you have, more and more wealth of this concentrated in fewer and fewer people's hands, right? Obviously, if you're going to have a wealth tax, you're not going to want to have an estate tax on top of that. But the assumption is the people that have accumulated all this money have paid a reasonable amount of taxes in accumulating it. Well, that's not necessarily true under our current tax system, and it also assumes that we're paying our way. We know that's not true. We're not paying our way at all. We're mortgaging the future big time.
Well, I think the birth burden concept is a saleable idea. That's got legs. That could really work there. Well, Dave, Thanks for doing this. The book is America in 2040, Still a Superpower, A Pathway to Success. Where can people pick this up?
Well, you order it online, okay? You order it through Amazon.com, authorhouse.com, or barnesandnoble.com. They print it on demand. You know, I wasn't looking to make money on this because this is a public service as far as I'm concerned. And so I self-published it. Now, all my other books have been done through major publishers. And as I said, the last one was a bestseller. I actually think this one is a better book than the one that was a bestseller. But because I self-published it, and it's not going to sell as many copies. But we've already gotten copies to every member of the House of Representatives. We're soon going to get a copy to every member of the U.S. Senate. And as I said, it is written to where if you've got a high school education, you can easily understand everything that's in here. And I obviously am not independent, but I think it's a darn good book.
Right. Yep.
It's gotten good ratings. It's gotten very good ratings. Very good ratings if you look online.
I need to leave a review, actually.
Thank you. Please do.
I will. I know how hard those are to get. Folks, check this book out and get educated, at least. Even if you don't agree with what David has to say or everything that he has to say, you will get a picture of what is actually going on out there, which can be hard to find. Dave, thanks a lot for doing this. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity. All the best.
Thanks for joining us. I really recommend you to go right now before you forget and pick up a copy of Dave's book on Amazon. Read it, study it, and don't worry, it's not going to be a lot of work, but really educate yourself about what's actually going on with the budget process in this country. I mean, when Dave said, look, different parts of government don't get together and form a cohesive strategy, unlike other opponent nation states, whoa, like that ought to take the top of your head off. Like, it's time to really do something about that. Can you imagine a CEO of a business running it that way? Now, I'm not saying that government and business are the same or should be run alike. I'm not actually a subscriber of that. However, good fiscal policy is important, and we need to get back on track here. So go check that out. Look, if your business is struggling, if you're in the space and defense industry, if you are cognizant that you need to get a more commercial point of view, a more commercial type of culture built into your organization. Say you've been a defense contractor for the last 30 years, you've got 50 plus people working for you, and you have been getting steady government contracts, but you know in your bones that competition is about to attack and you had better get some commercial blood into your system. Come talk to us at Cold Star Tech. This is one of the best things that we can do for you. I mean, Dave and I are talking for a reason, and I'll tell you what it is. It's overlap of cultural ideas. We know and we agree on what needs to be done and what kind of values and principles and processes need to be handled, taken care of, and purported, like pushed forward, right? Values. What do you stand for? And if you stand for plodding along as the same old kind of defense contractor you've always been, you're going to get the same kind of results, and you're not going to compete well against fast, nimble, quick, changing direction, able to change companies that are coming in competition in that commercial field. You know, back in the late 90s when I first started out, I worked for a small power generation company, and we went up against big companies, and I'll tell you, we were able to respond to customer demands, customer requests, changes in equipment specifications and that, big deals, right? We could do it in a day, and our competitors, the big lumbering giants, could not, and that would get us orders, let me tell you, because sometimes it's better to be a small fish in the big pond. Those folks, those customers want that feeling of personalized service, that they matter to you, not just that you matter to them as a big fish customer. All right, I've talked enough. If you want to find out more about how we at Cold Star Tech can help your space or defense business become a viable commercial entity rather than government grants, come talk to us, find me on LinkedIn, or go to coldstartech.com. Thanks again for listening.